On this week's Carrier App, we speak with PwC to discuss the growing Internet of Things market and potential impact from U.S. government policy. Well, thanks for joining us in this week's Carrier App. I'm your host, Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief here at RCR Wireless News. And this week we are lucky to again be joined by Dan Hayes, who's a principal at PwC's Strategy and Division, to talk a bit about IoT. So, hey, Dan, thanks for joining us this week. We appreciate it.
Hey, thanks a lot, Dan. I'm really glad to be here.
Great. Well, maybe start off with maybe an overview, or maybe setting the table, I guess, for where we are in the IoT market today. I mean, I think we see almost on a daily basis new news about IoT, a new company being involved, carriers, government agencies. I mean, it seems like you can't get away from IoT anywhere nowadays. And so maybe start off with, I guess, what's your general view on kind of where we are today, I guess, in terms of the development of this new market, which some might say is an old market, at least we call it M2M, but whatever, we'll get past that. But where do you think we are today in the market?
Yeah, hey, what's old is new again, right? Or what's new is old again. I don't know how it goes. But yeah, no, I mean, IoT is definitely the hot topic of the day. And I think that for many in the wireless industry, IoT is sort of the bright, shiny object that's out there for all of us to look and say, hey, this is the future. It's the next thing. I think lots of people are excited about it. And quite frankly, for good reason. I think we've gotten past the whole wave of 4G, and it's rolling out around the world. It's successful. People are making money. And so now people are looking for the next thing, and IoT seems to be it. The interesting part for us and what we're really focused on right now is, trying to help people get their heads around what is IoT, because I mean, it's one of these things where it's almost as broad as the universe. You look at it and you say, well, anything that could be connected to anything over any technology, right? Lots of different things. So there's a few ways that we're looking at it now. I mean, you talked about M2M, for example, right? And that's a good place to start. Mm-hmm. M2M really, right? We all know it means machine to machine, right? M2M historically was really very focused on anything where machines were just connecting to one another, and it more or less didn't require human interaction. So, I look at it, there's a lot of different ways there, right? So, for example, maybe you have like a tracking device on a vehicle, right? Your old, go find my car when it gets stolen kind of.
The load jack thing, yeah, for instance, yeah.
So, that's a great example of where you got a connected device. There's not really human intervention, right? Unless something happens, and then you're using the data that's coming off of it. Whereas my latest favorite example of an IoT device, which actually does have a degree of human intervention, is I got one of those fancy connected doorbells recently, and you know what? Honestly, it's pretty cool. Yeah. So in all fairness, my wife set it up and connected it, but you know what? It works great. And last week I was over in Europe, and all of a sudden somebody rang my doorbell, and I'm going, it's 9 o'clock at night. It means it's 3 o'clock at home. All right. I wonder what's going on. And I was on the Wi-Fi in the hotel there, so I answered my doorbell. I'm in Paris. My house is in Washington, D.C. Turns out it was my kid coming home from school, right? So I'm able to talk to my kid from school through the doorbell, right? as they're coming into the house, coming home from school for the day. It's actually pretty cool, pretty practical, and it's a good example of what the Internet of Things promises. So, this whole sort of M2M, maybe not requiring human interaction versus things where you have some human interaction is one way we're looking at it. And then, of course, the other piece of it is, that example is a great consumer example. Yeah. But, of course, I think where a lot of people are focused today is more on the enterprise space. And so you see, actually, I think right now, more action and more focus on IoT in developing enterprise applications than you do even around the consumer space. The consumer stuff's a little easier to understand, easier to get past. But in the enterprise space, you got a lot more complicated things. Like I was talking to the CIO of a train company recently that operates railroads, and they're really interested in IoT because not only does it enable them to do things like tracking rail cars, but it actually enables some really advanced functionality like what they call positive train control, right? There was a big train accident up in the Northeast last year, right, where they didn't have the ability to remotely control and manage the speed of the train. Well, the railroads are really interested in enabling that, but to do this, they need the communications capabilities, right? The two-way communications for the locomotives. Yeah. So, pretty practical examples in the enterprise space, but it's still very much developing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you bring up a couple of great use cases there where it's almost like the extremes really of what this thing is. And like you said, it does seem like IoT has become the catch-all for all of these things. I mean, it's interesting the development and the pace of it really. But like you said, obviously the infrastructure is going to be a big part of this. You have to have wireless networks, wireline networks, a lot of communication networks in place to do all this. And again, you also need to have, I think, some regulations as well. I think that's something we want to talk about as well, is the fact that, when it comes to, what role does the government play in all of this? Because, I mean, for the most part, it seems like it's kind of developed to this point without a lot of government intervention. But, as you get to some of these, not necessarily public safety issues, but, again, like with the railroad, there are some markets that are somewhat regulated that I'm guessing this will have an impact in them. So I'm guessing government will have some control of this. I mean, I guess what's your view of what the role of government is in some of these, use cases and industries that are looking to use IoT?
Yeah, well, the answer is it's going to vary a bit based on what the use case is and what the need is. I mean, one of the distinctions that we see as really important in IoT, and there's probably 2 or 3 out there, one of them is what type of connectivity does it need, and really meaning where is it going to be used? So you have a lot of these cases, like my doorbell doesn't need a cellular connection, right? My doorbell can ride on my Wi-Fi just fine. It's not going anywhere, right? But the train, right, might not only need a cellular connection, it might actually need something that's even got greater coverage. It might use cellular when it's in a cellular coverage, and it might use satellite when it's traveling across the country going, God knows where. So, that's one big distinction for us, is this whole notion of sort of fixed IoT versus nomadic or mobile, IoT. That's going to be a big distinction. Another one that you kind of hit on is, is it what you can think of as mission critical or essential type of capability, right? You got some of these things, like one of the examples I was talking to someone about the other day was, right, you've got some of these things where, let's say you've got a firefighter who's going into a burning building or a forest or whatever it is. Yeah, they need communications, but you might actually now have, life monitoring systems that are monitoring their pulse, their oxygen, right? Things that are going on to make sure that they're safe within the fire. Mm-hmm. Well, you don't want that to be dependent upon a connection that, the site goes out or something happens, or you got a building with thick walls and it doesn't penetrate it. So you might need to have, for some of these really critical applications, maybe a failover or backup technology that's going to create some redundancy, for some of these mission critical applications, right? And there's a lot of those out there that are health or safety related. Another great one that seems to be coming up all the time now, can't turn a page of the newspaper, it feels like, is connected cars. Yeah. Right? You want your car to drive through a tunnel and not be able to, and not be able to do its sort of automated driving, right? Driverless cars. Yeah. That's not going to be an acceptable problem. So we're going to need to find a way to really get pervasive connectivity, to all of these. So those are some of the big issues. And, you talk about the role of government in all of this. Well, there's lots of viewpoints on that. I think many people in government would say, well, it's our job to make sure people stay safe and healthy. And yeah, that's probably true. But at the same time, right, the mobile industry, the wireless industry has a great track record of innovating and finding creative solutions to these real problems that create value for society. And so I think we're going to see, over the coming months and years, really a lot of vigorous debate around this, around what should the role of government be. And there's a lot of things that they can be doing in this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing, is that going to be a big challenge then for the industry to kind of convince regulators that, hey, we can handle this, to try to keep, because again, the wireless industry has always had kind of a bit of hands-off approach when it comes to regulation. I mean, even current chairman has, always touted the light touch approach and things like that when it comes to the telecom and specifically the mobile space. Is it going to be a challenge for the industry to to keep that going, to make sure the government doesn't get too involved? Because that's always been a bit of a sticking point, it seems like, with industry.
Yeah, and I think, if I could summarize that in one word, it comes down to trust.
Okay.
And a lot of it really is about, are the operators and others in the mobile industry, and, you have to throw the device manufacturers into this, maybe even the equipment companies, are they really trusted to have the reliability, the privacy, the security for all these things? Because some of these things, you're getting into some really sensitive information where you're monitoring things, you're dealing with health data, you're tracking people and assets and things like that. And there's a lot of concerns around that. Privacy is one really big dimension. We look at this, we've got a kind of a list of things that we think are important from a government support of IoT perspective, right? So one is you want the government to foster the innovation and the technology, right? And that'll come from government programs, from them endorsing it. It even comes down to things like tax policy and such, that you want the government to provide the right incentives and remove the barriers to really innovating, in this space. You also want them to be able to make the kind of second thing, the resources available. So we talk a lot, you and I have talked many, many times about spectrum, and IoT is sort of the next generation of spectrum demand. Mm-hmm. And you want, as a government entity or as government entities around the world, you want to make the spectrum available so that there's not that barrier towards rolling out IoT, so you've got the capacity and the coverage, right? So you can have that pervasive connectivity that you need for those really critical applications. The third thing is really driving demand, from a public resources standpoint. You want the government to say, hey, look, let's make good, efficient use of the public resources that we have. Right? In the mobile industry, for example, we want to make sure we've got the ability to locate new sites. We want to make sure we've got public rights of way, and that we've got appropriate access so we can deploy these new networks and new technologies. There's other things in there. I think how do they encourage investment in infrastructure? And then, of course, one thing we hear about all the time in the telecom world is the competitive playing field, right? Is there enough competition? Well, you want there to be a level playing field, right? IoT is going to require a lot of people to come in and innovate and make investments, take risks, entrepreneurial behavior. The government, can really encourage that and make sure that we don't have the barriers to make that happen. The last thing is, the government's a big customer for this. Yeah. And if there's one thing that I think the government could do really well, all around the world, is be a good adopter of IoT. Mm-hmm. Really think about it. And in fact, you see some of this happening. We're seeing it happening in interesting corners of the world. Smart cities tends to be the label that a lot of it falls under. We're involved, for example, right now in a major smart cities deployment in Kazakhstan, of all places. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, you think about, gosh, is that the place where you'd expect IoT innovation to really be happening? But the governments in these countries see significant value in what this can do and what IoT can bring to help advance their economy and their society.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, I know China, for instance, is being very aggressive with their smart cities programs as well. They're pushing out, I think, 200 cities, I believe, as well. So yeah, the smart city thing, that's a whole another 2-hour conversation we can have there. But you're right, that does seem like that's become almost as popular as IoT and 5G when it comes to conversations about where we're going in the future. And as you're bringing up these subjects, a couple things popped in my head. One was, obviously, like you mentioned, the spectrum challenge. And that does seem like that's a bit of an issue because, when it comes to kind of this move towards, 5G or whatever we're looking at down the road, there's a lot of different spectrum bands being thought about being used, upper bands, millimeter wave, centimeter wave bands. But it seems like for a lot of this IoT stuff, the low band spectrum is going to be pretty important as well from a coverage perspective. And obviously, the FCC is in the middle of a process right now to get some spectrum out there at below 1 gigahertz. But it seems like that is going to be a challenge for the government to make sure that there's not just a lot of spectrum available, but the right kind of spectrum, really, to support these. I mean, obviously, the higher bands are going to be great, too, for a lot of capacity things. But again, for the broader connected car issues and things like that, and just, public safety thing, it seems like that broader coverage is going to be key to this. So it seems like spectrum is going to be a huge challenge for regulators going forward.
I think it is. I think you're very right. And, while there's a lot of spectrum available in the higher frequencies, IoT for the pervasiveness of connectivity and for coverage is going to require a mix. Yeah. So you're going to have a hybrid solution. This isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. So, low band, and here in the U.S., we've got, as you mentioned, the 600 megahertz auction taking place, the broadcast spectrum auction. Mm-hmm. Some of that spectrum will likely wind up deployed for IoT because it really does have great propagation characteristics. It'll be available in buildings. So there's a lot of good characteristics for that band. At the same time, mid and upper band spectrum will be needed for other purposes, right? We talked earlier about the need to have not just cellular, coverage, but maybe also satellite. Yeah. We're going to need some satellite spectrum available and applied for IoT. We're also going to possibly need to repurpose some stuff we're already using, but maybe aren't making the most efficient use of. Refarm it, back out for other uses. The other spectrum in the higher frequencies that we've been talking about for 5G. Yeah, it's going to be out there. It'll be great for capacity. But, let's be honest, a lot of IoT applications just aren't going to be huge capacity drains, right? Yeah. Those sensors and monitors don't take up an awful lot of bandwidth, but they do require a lot of connectivity.
Yeah, and maybe the unlicensed spectrum might be a bigger play in this as well, because again, most homes, again, like you said in your own house there, I'm guessing you're using maybe the 2.4 band for your services now, but again, as we connect more and more 2.4 in our homes, obviously the 5 gigahertz band is going to become more and more important when it comes to unlicensed using Wi-Fi technologies as well. So maybe that might be a bigger play as well as we move forward in the IoT space too.
Yeah, and I have no doubt that 3.5 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz that are targeted for near-term unlicensed LTE use, there'll be big players in this.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, I guess another thing I want to touch on quickly was, you mentioned the government being its own a customer of IoT. That kind of almost brought to my mind the whole FirstNet initiative. I know FirstNet's a bit different, perhaps, but FirstNet, the whole goal of FirstNet is to provide a fairly broad coverage broadband network covering areas that perhaps aren't covered today. And it seems like those might be maybe a kind of a cool way to expand IoT coverage into areas too. Is there any connection maybe using FirstNet as a template for broader IoT coverage, you think, or is that still maybe a bit off and not quite ready for that?
Yeah, I think the jury's still out on the pace at which FirstNet will proceed. I think they're in their RFP process right now for who's going to be sort of the prime contractor to build it in the United States. Yeah. But I think to your point, FirstNet absolutely has within its scope a focus on enabling not only voice and data connectivity, but IoT type of applications, right? Whether it's monitoring a border fence or whether it's, monitoring traffic in your local town. Yeah. Those are things that certainly you can expect that FirstNet may use over time. Plus the spectrum on FirstNet, the way that it's set up, it may also wind up that whoever wins the award can also use some of that spectrum for commercial purposes, including IoT. What's interesting is that FirstNet obviously is being overseen by the NTIA within the U.S. Department of Commerce, and most recently NTIA put out a request for comments on the subject of IoT and what role the government should play. So they're clearly thinking about this from a bunch of different dimensions.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to watch how that might play out as well. But and I guess as you look at the general wireless market in general, and maybe the wireless carriers. Not bringing anybody specifically, but does it seem like that the wireless industry is in a good position to take advantage of what's coming along in IoT? I know there's a lot involved with IoT still, and coverage and things like that. But does it seem like that the wireless space is in a good position to kind of take advantage of what's coming down the road in terms of opportunities in IoT?
Look, I think the wireless operators, the mobile network operators, are very well positioned to capitalize on IoT. The big question that's looming out there is, will they be anything more than access plays in this? And the reality is that precious few of our mobile network operators really have the deep vertical market, application-oriented type of capabilities to develop against all these use cases for IoT. right? I think it's tough for them to make those types of investments. And, will there be some that will go down that path? I'm sure there are. There will certainly be some operators that are going to see this as a huge opportunity, not only to increase their revenue, but to increase their relevance in the IoT space. At the same time, we're already seeing a lot of over-the-top plays for IoT who are developing the devices, the applications, the services, to ride on top of the bigger networks. And then, the final thing is we're seeing purpose-built IoT networks start to emerge, right? Whether it's in the utilities space, or we're starting to see the automotive industry say, if they're going to do, autonomous vehicles, that maybe they need their own networks to run those. Well, so we may see some purpose-built networks just for IoT, which would be really interesting. We haven't had quite so much of that in a long time, probably back to the days of the walkie-talkie.
That's a good point. I know a lot of organizations are trying to do stuff. I think there's Sigfox and other things like that are coming out to try to do these things. And yeah, it'd be interesting to see how those interact with the already established commercial players. And like you said, a lot of those commercial guys, some are kind of, dipping their toes in the water when it comes to, whether it's home automation or doing home security, things like that. But again, yeah, it does seem like carriers are a bit risk averse when it comes to kind of, going deep into a lot of these new markets without knowing exactly what the business model or business case is going to be for them. So it'll be interesting to watch them kind of play through that.
Well, and in fact, you mentioned the government earlier on this. One interesting dimension of it is now that you have all of these applications, you have the corresponding government agencies that interact with them who all of a sudden have woken up and said, hey, wait a second, I'm a stakeholder for this, right? So here in the U.S., the U.S. Department of Energy is interested in the utility space. The U.S. Department of Transportation is interested in automated, in autonomous vehicles, right? The Department of Commerce is interested very broadly in terms of the economic input. You got, environmental protection, Homeland Security, Department of Defense, right? Everybody has a stake, which is part of why I think you're seeing this request for comments come out, because now they're saying, well, wait a second, how do we organize ourselves as government around this topic? Because everybody's got a stake in it.
Yeah, and again, bringing more and more government agencies that operate normally in a separate environment together on one topic, not that it won't be a good idea, but I'm sure that's going to lead to some delays here and there, or at least some issues that I'm guessing that will be something that needs to be worked through as well. That's going to be a whole new
not for the faint of heart.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I guess maybe one final question is, how important is this support of IoT for the U.S. in terms of the international community? Because it does seem like, again, like we were talking about every day, we're hearing IoT stuff, and a lot of it's, like you said, Kazakhstan, there's stuff going on in China, Europe, other parts of Asia. It seems like almost everywhere you look, there's IoT initiatives going on, and a lot of governments are, depends on where they are getting behind this or less behind it in kind of different ways. How important is it for the U.S. To be fairly aggressive and kind of stamping its claim to, hey, we're behind this initiative. Whatever happens, we want to be part of whatever rules or regulations or standards that come out. How important is it for the U.S. to be part of that, bigger global conversation?
Yeah, it is tremendously important. And I got to tell you, this is where I think the competitiveness of countries and of the U.S. economy really comes into play here. While I was over in Europe last week, actually, I got to spend a little bit of time with one of the ministers from the European Union who's focused on digital. Mm-hmm. And he had some really interesting thoughts on this. And quite frankly, he's been out there calling for the European Union to unite around IoT because they see the potential economic benefit of being leaders in this. I think here in the U.S., we have the same kind of call to action going on. Congress recently, put forward a bill to try and focus, around IoT. If you look at what we've done, I mean, history is a great educator here, right? What we did with 4G and the leadership position that the U.S. took in the mobile industry as a result of being ahead of the curve on 4G really has put us in very, very good stead, for not only the mobile industry, but for the impact and the use of all those technologies. I think that, there's hope for many of us that the U.S. and both government and industry can come together and really, move us ahead and stay ahead using IoT probably as a little bit of a intermediary step towards what we're doing with 5G as well. IoT, it doesn't need 5G per se, for many applications. It'll benefit from it. But I think if we can get our position in IoT to be strong and marching in one direction, then we've got the opportunity to extend that lead that we had with 4G. Yeah,
it makes sense. Well, hey, Dan, again, we appreciate the great insight on this topic. Obviously, like we were saying at the beginning of this, IoT is just like a market that's expanding, it seems like daily. The growth of it, at least the hype around it maybe, I don't know about the growth itself, but it seems like the growth is going to catch up with the hype at some point. And if that ever happens, it's going to be pretty significant. So it's always good to get some great insight from you. Obviously, it's good to get kind of the regulatory angle as well, because again, that's going to be a big part of this market going forward. So we definitely appreciate the insight on that today. Thanks so much for the time today.
Thanks a lot, Dan.
All right. Well, thanks for watching this week's show. Make sure to check us out again next week when we are scheduled to speak with MVNO Republic Wireless to discuss its latest devices and service advances.